Thanks very much indeed. Lovely to see everybody here, and thank you very much indeed for coming along, as my colleague Peter has said. So what do we think about the policy change from the government then? Yeah, my thoughts exactly. Of all the things that the new government could have made a big hit on, could have pointed to the absolute disaster of policy over the last 14 years and made a lot of gains, saved farmers a lot of money, saved the taxpayer a lot of money, being truthful with voters, the public, farmers and parliamentarians, this would have been it. But they bottled it. Not only that, but they have broken a number of electoral promises. Yes, they did say they would end the cull, and no, they didn't say when they would end the cull. As a former civil servant, I'm very used to politicians saying they will do something and not being entirely sure when they're going to do something. But this one really takes the biscuit, doesn't it? So to the end of January of this year, over 230,000 badgers had been slaughtered. That's very close to half the English population of badgers. At the beginning of 2012, what proportion of the English cattle herd was prematurely slaughtered following a positive bovine TB test? Anyone? And what proportion of the English cattle herd was that? 0.5%, half of 1%. In 2022, it was 0.4%. Spectacular reduction, I don't think. And that was as a result of a whole raft of measures. I had asked my colleagues which was their favourite DEFRA lie or dirty trick I should treat you to this morning, and they said too many to choose from. So I thought I would just run through a couple of my own personal favourites. So here's one. All policy is actually a policy pack, the doubling of cattle testing in the high-risk area, bringing into line with cattle frequency testing in Wales, the increased use of a much more sensitive cattle test, bringing into line with testing in Wales, much tighter cattle movement control, not yet bringing into line with cattle movement control in Wales, and requirements for hygiene on farms, not yet bringing into line with requirements in Wales, plus badger culling. All of that is known as the badger control policy. That has allowed DEFRA to claim erroneously but sneakily that any reductions in bovine TB have arisen from the badger control policy, which has also allowed them to sneakily and mendaciously tell us that 56% reduction in herd risk of bovine TB followed the badger control policy. Now, for those of you who actually read the Birch report, you know that's nonsense because Birch says that's nonsense. But the Badger Trust had to resort to going to solicitors and getting DEFRA solicitors on the record for DEFRA to confess, and you can see this, we'll post it for you, that DEFRA admit they do not know what, if any, proportion of bovine TB has been affected by culling badgers. It comes to something when a very small wildlife charity has to go to solicitors to challenge the Secretary of State through his solicitors to get them to confess what science has known since RBCT. So that's one of my favourite dirty tricks. My other favourite dirty trick is the amount of BTB that remains hidden in the cattle herd. The current test in England might leave between 50 and 15% of all infected cattle undetected. However careful the farmer, however careful the vet, this is not blaming farmers, it's not blaming vets. This is squarely blaming DEFRA and DEFRA policy, which the guys over there could change at the stroke of a pen. And they could do it without damaging the farming industry, because they could pay enhanced compensation to farmers to take up better cattle testing, to take up the cattle measures which will keep their herds safe and keep people's livelihoods safe. They could do that at the stroke of a pen. Unfortunately, at the moment, they're willing to spend many millions of pounds not doing that. When we asked DEFRA through a Freedom of Information request why in England DEFRA chose to use the least reliable standard test in cattle in England, DEFRA's holding response to me was, well, we need a bit more time to answer that because the answer might be commercially sensitive. In other words, it's an awful lot cheaper, they think, to hide disease than to admit it exists. I'm so glad DEFRA weren't in charge of COVID, aren't you? However, Wales does use a more reliable test, so Wales identifies more disease. And the Welsh government, having been alerted to this problem, have now challenged DEFRA data to stop misrepresenting Welsh data on the same scale as English data for bovine TB, pretending it's using the same scale, which it clearly is not. So hopefully on September the 11th, when we get the next DEFRA data drop, we'll see a more truthful picture of the difference between England and Wales. If Steve Reed is listening, I'm absolutely sure he's not, but if he was listening, he could show a little bit of ambition, couldn't he? Let's start with an honest appraisal of the real extent of bovine TB in the national cattle herd. Be ambitious, Steve. At the very least, use the same standard of testing and hygiene they use in Wales. Go for it. Have a bit more ambition, Steve. Go on. Use the same test they use in cattle in Europe. They're a hell of a lot more reliable. To export live cattle to Europe, you have to use the same test they use. Why not use that here? Why not relieve farmers and taxpayers of the burden of hidden disease in the cattle herd? And then we can stop messing about pretending that badgers or deer or soil microorganisms or anything else are to blame. The badgers are innocent. Of those farmers, and I admit it was not very many farmers who responded, but of those farmers who responded to the Badger Trust survey in 2023, to the question, do you think badgers should be culled regardless of BTB, 87.3% of those responding farmers said yes. BTB is an excuse for a lot of the culling. Let's not forget that. End the badger cull. You could do it today. You could save the amount of money that it would otherwise cost you to pay 400 newly qualified nurses. I know what I'd rather spend it on. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosie. Rosie's 24/7 against the badger cull. I'm sure everybody here is. But great to hear her speak. Next up is Rob Pownall from Protect the Wild.
Yeah. Hello everyone. I've actually written a speech today just to make sure I don't rant too much and say things that are going to get me in even more trouble. So I'm going to follow this word for word, which I wrote about 10 minutes ago. If I've met you in the crowd already, you'll know my views and the views of Protect the Wild. So yeah, here goes. Thank you for coming, first of all. Thank you for supporting ourselves and the other brilliant organisations here today. Most importantly though, thank you for supporting the badgers and for caring. Badger culls are an affront to a civilised way of life. They're an attack on democracy and they're an attack on science and logic. Badger culling started over a decade ago, and yet ridiculously here we are today outside Parliament still fighting for it to end. It is clearly not the solution to dealing with BTB, otherwise we wouldn't be here, would we? The issue lies in the herd, and it's about time farmers take responsibility. The awful conditions in which cattle are kept and the poor hygiene measures in place in which cows are literally walking around in each other's shit is the main reason that BTB remains rampant. Badgers have been scapegoated for far too long, and farmers have got off the hook as they continue to profit and gain from the exploitation of animals in their care. It is time to address the elephant in the room that without animal farming itself, badger culling wouldn't be happening. Without people consuming milk and other animal products and driving demand for this cruel industry, then badger culling wouldn't be happening and we wouldn't need to be here in the first place. We can't just keep addressing the symptom of an awful, awful industry that shouldn't be there in the first place. How long are we going to continue to address the symptom and ignore the root cause of the mess that we are in? And as we look forward, tens of thousands of badgers are still set to be slaughtered under this new Labour government in a shameful and disgraceful policy that shows nothing has changed one bit since the Tories left government. Until 2029, this iconic British species faces years more of intensive culling because this government are too afraid to do what's right. It's time to end the badger cull, not in a week or in a month or in 5 bloody years' time, but today. The badger cull must end. Save money and serve the working people is what Labour promised, and it's about time they delivered it. Please keep up the pressure. Join those on the ground in the coal zones. Sign petitions, write letters, keep attending demos, speak to your local MP, do everything and anything you can to help end this madness for good. And together we will hopefully see the day where all animals are left alone and given the right to live.
Thank you, Rob. And so our next speaker is Alice Brough, who is a ex-vet.
Yeah, perfect, thank you. Okay, hello. So briefly, I'm a farmer's granddaughter and a vet. I worked as a commercial pig vet for 4 years, with ranging from your small family farm to your giant industrial factory farm, hundreds of Britain's pig farms under my care. But I started off in mixed practice before that for over a year in dairy, beef and sheep. Speaking up within the industry saw me banned from premises, and subsequent whistleblowing has landed me in all sorts of predictably challenging situations. And I'll just preface this by saying that obviously everything I say, all these opinions are my own. I grew up very much immersed in nature. I had the full complement of beetle, bug and bird books, and I had a little microscope for closer inspection of leaves and feathers. And I joined the veterinary profession because I love animals, and I left because I love animals. The way I saw nature and her creatures treated by our food system was truly something I could have never been prepared for. When you've been involved in death on an enormous scale, you realise that life is so very precious. During lockdown, I spent huge amounts of time in an arboretum, which was closed to the public. I sort of climbed in the back. But during that time, without all the manicuring and the disruption, the renewed abundance of creatures was incredible. I had really close encounters with fox cubs and deer and birds I'd never seen. It was very much my Snow White era. But outside of this arboretum, the UK is particularly tragic in its biodiversity. We're in the bottom 10% of countries in the world. This biodiversity, this rich mosaic of life, is essential for our survival. So this tapestry of different species within functioning ecosystems protects us from disease. It's a buffer for pandemics, alongside, of course, many other benefits to our health, not least allowing us to be able to produce food. Without this natural buffer of sort of self-limiting populations, genetic variability, and geographic spread, we're susceptible to disease transmission from wildlife to us to farmed animals and vice versa. The spill of pathogens onto farms, which happens because, of course, in creating these farms, we're encroaching on natural habitats, allows the establishment of a disease reservoir. Our movement of livestock, their waste and products, distributes these pathogens, and the sheer volume of almost genetically identical animals in small spaces allows an opportunity for disease to learn how to evade immune systems, how best to spread, and evade also the medicines that we throw at it. Why are dairy cows seemingly more susceptible to TB? I'm sure many of us will be familiar with the effects of chronic stress on our own health. So let's for a moment think about what the dairy cow goes through in her life. Genetically selected for obscene milk yields, 10 times more than her calf would ordinarily drink. They're repeatedly inseminated to carry a baby for 9 months, to then have that baby taken from them straight after birth. Farmed animals are stressed, they're sick, they're dropping dead. 46,000 pigs are dying each week on British farms, not the ones that make it to slaughter, on farms. 46,000 a week, that's just the pig industry. So why are badgers coming onto farms? Where I live, Shropshire, one of the cull zones, 86% of our land is agricultural. In the UK, 83% of all agricultural land is used for animal agriculture. So I'm to assume that 70% of my entire county is taken up by livestock. So why are badgers coming near farms? Why are any wild animals coming into areas of human development? Simply because we've left them precious little option. We've destroyed their homes and we've killed their food. And it seems our conditioned reaction to that is to villainise the wildlife themselves, rather than face up to what we've done. Farmers and landowners have been pushed this idea that badgers are the problem. It was something to do. And it prevents industries taking accountability. And now they can't get that idea out of their heads, despite it being based on wrong information. We know that many other animals carry and spread disease, including bovine TB. Pigs get it. Are we to cull the entire pig industry to protect the cows? We can get it. Perhaps we should steer clear too. This is a pattern. Foxes are killed to protect sheep farm profits. Birds are shot indiscriminately in the name of feed conversion, or are hunted to protect the pig industry under the guise of controlling a disease that we don't even have. Pigeons were domesticated for our use and then dumped. They now don't know how to fend for themselves, and we hate them for it. Deer are managed without question, and I'd implore you to look up Randall Plunkett at the Dunsany Estate and how his growing deer population intuitively manage his woodland to perfection without any interference from him. These ecosystems maintain balance naturally. We learn that in primary school. I've seen farmers liberally scatter rat poison open to any passing wildlife, and then laugh as they kick poisoned rodents into the pig pens to be eaten. One of countless hideous incidents I could share. But the point is, these wild species, persecuted largely by farmers and the rural elite, are, unbeknownst to them, essential to everything they hold dear. Badgers play a vital role in ecosystems. They're very important predators, and ironically, their unique predation of small mammals likely provides protection to a lot of other livestock diseases. Small mammals are, of course, all over farms because, once again, our fault, they are filthy and there's feed everywhere. Rewilded ecosystems can store and sequester carbon, reduce effects of flooding and climate change, vital for future farming. What doesn't do that is livestock grazing. So this trendy term that we hear a lot, regenerative farming, was manufactured by the industry to make us feel better about continuously consuming their damaging products. What's actually regenerating in regenerative farming? It's not biodiversity, and it certainly isn't the cow. In fact, the only species that really seem to benefit from livestock grazing are dung beetles. If we were to introduce more widely a level of livestock into wild spaces that could just about be maintained without causing huge damage, we would afford ourselves approximately 1 piece of meat a year. So beware these constantly emerging fairy tales. The reality is that industrial agriculture has taken hold of Britain. We're outnumbered by farmed animals, land animals, and one. And this has obviously come through rising demand. Over a third of our pig and poultry industries are effectively owned by global meat giants. 85% of our farmed animals are factory farms, and that figure doesn't include things like RSPCA assured farms, which I can assure you are essentially factory farming. And we also import huge amounts of these products plus feed for our animals, using 1.4 times our land footprint to do so. So consider what goes into these animals and then comes out in the slurry. Vaccines, hormones, antibiotics, parasiticides, steroids, anti-inflammatories. The sheer volume of chemicals, disinfectants, biocides used by the gallon, the single-use plastics, the poisons, the toxic flybait, rodenticides, the list goes on. Just 50 cows are capable of emitting the equivalent amount of pollution as a human settlement of 10,000 people. The Environment Agency have clearly stated that the majority of river pollution comes from farming, and that the majority of inspected dairy farms have been actively polluting in breach of regulations. Back to TB, needless to say, spreading vast quantities of infected feces all over our grazing land, crops and waterways is a bit of a risk for maintaining and spreading disease. So this and many other good points were made in the Brian May documentary I'm sure everybody watched. But I feel there's a couple of points in that I want to address. Firstly, desperate farming families seeing cattle slaughtered, crying as they, quote, load up their best animals in their prime of life. Somebody's got to say it. That is the entire business model for animal farming. As someone who's been involved in... And I say this as someone from a farming family, I've seen the emotion, but as someone who's been involved in mass culls and has the PTSD to show for it, it's not nice, but why are we having to do it in the first place? And how is it different to business as usual? Secondly, the fury at being forced to diversify, forced to change, as if every other business doesn't have to adapt to societal progress and modern knowledge. The suggestion that not forcing it might be a good place to really triggered the NFU, didn't it? Yeah. We appear to have collectively lost our minds on this one. I mean, can anyone think of a single disease we've managed to eradicate without an effective vaccine, a test that actually works, or appropriate biosecurity measures? They're not doing farmers any favours with this blunt resistance to change. The government propping them up with subsidies and bailouts are ultimately not helping. For some reason, over a century of having this disease, we're still not implementing scientifically relevant options. Why? Trade, money. It always comes back to this. As long as they're able to sell a product, I'm afraid they don't give a damn about health, welfare, or environment. A good example of this, last year, AHDB Pork, which is like the levy body for the pig industry, acted on clear messages from members to focus on marketing, exports and reputation. And so they've ditched their pig health scheme, which was health monitoring at abattoirs, and their real welfare outcome scheme, meaning that vets don't have to perform any sort of objective welfare assessment on retracted farms. It's incredible they feel confident publishing that. So what's the solution? Where do we place that hope that I felt a little flicker of during lockdown? Those of you that attended the Restore Nature Now March this year, I'm sure will have noticed that almost all of the speakers emphasise that we must rewild. This is the key to every problem we're facing. But then, other than really Dale Vince, sadly isn't here today, didn't explicitly allude to exactly where the land for that rewilding will come from. and what is actually required of us to free up that land. So if you take away nothing else from this, let it be this. 76% of farmland could be rewilded with a transition to a plant-based food system. Globally, which is nearly a quarter of our entire land mass freed up for wildlife. And badger culling would obviously be irrelevant at that point. I haven't plucked this out of thin air. The largest study to date was a recent comprehensive meta-analysis that looked at nearly 40,000 farms. The team of researchers at Oxford University started that study omnivores and ended it vegan. They concluded that the single biggest thing we can do for the planet and its inhabitants, including the badgers, is to be vegan. And fundamentally, manufacturers supply what